Welcome, friends. Tonight we step softly into the quiet world of medieval peasants, where the loss of a husband changed everything. Imagine a life where love and labor were deeply intertwined, and widowhood meant facing not only grief, but a sudden shift in survival and status. In these times, being a widow was far from just an emotional journey. It was a daily test of endurance, managing the household, navigating complex laws, and coping with the often harsh judgment of community eyes. The shadow of loss stretched over every part of life, but within it were stories of resilience, courage, and the unyielding strength of those left behind. Tonight, you'll hear about the real lives of medieval widows, their struggles, their solitude, and the quiet ways they carved out space in a world that often tried to push them aside. Settle in, take a slow breath, and let the flickering light of a solitary candle lead you gently back through time. This is What Being a Widow Was Really Like as a Medieval Peasant, and more. Welcome to the journey. The sudden silence. In the life of a medieval peasant, existence was a partnership, a constant, unspoken duet performed against the backdrop of the seasons. A husband and wife were a single economic unit, their roles intertwined like the threads of a coarse woolen cloth. His strength was for the heavy plow, the axe, and the scythe. Her domain was the hearth, the spinning wheel, and the small garden patch beside the cottage. Their lives were a shared conversation of labor, a rhythm of two bodies moving through the same small world, their days measured by the same rising sun and the same tolling church bell. The home itself, a simple structure of wattle and daub with a thatched roof, was filled with the sounds of this partnership, the scrape of his boots on the earthen floor as he came in from the fields, the thud of wood being dropped by the fire, the low murmur of his voice in the evening. These were not just sounds. They were the auditory texture of security, the ambient noise of a complete life, however hard that life might be. His presence was a physical reality that filled the small space, a bulwark against the vast and often frightening world outside the cottage door. Then, one day, that presence would vanish. Death in the medieval world was an ever-present neighbor. It could come suddenly from the swift violence of an accident, a falling tree, a kick from an ox, a wound that festered. Or it could come slowly, a fever that burned for weeks, a wasting sickness, or the simple, quiet wearing out of a body exhausted by a lifetime of labor. In the final hours, the small cottage would become a crowded, sacred space. The parish priest might come to administer the last rites, his Latin chants a solemn, foreign sound in the familiar room. Neighbors would gather, their faces somber in the flickering light of a tallow candle, their presence a silent, communal vigil. And then it would be over. The final breath would be drawn, and in its place would descend a new and profound reality, a sudden, deafening silence. The silence was not merely an absence of sound, it was an absence of a fundamental part of the world. The space in the cottage where he used to sit was now an empty void. The side of the straw-filled mattress where he slept was cold. The tools he used, the billhook, the spade, leaned against the wall, now inert and ownerless. The very air in the room felt thinner, emptier. For the woman left behind, this was the moment her world fractured. She was no longer a wife. She was now a widow. The word itself carried the weight of this new silence. In the immediate aftermath, there was the necessary work of mourning. Neighbors, usually the other women of the village, would help to wash and shroud the body. The parish bell would toll, its slow, heavy clang announcing the death to the entire village, each strike echoing the hollowness she felt inside. The funeral would be a simple affair, a procession to the small churchyard, the body carried on a wooden bier, followed by the widow and her children. A humble wooden cross might be placed to mark the grave, a marker that would soon weather and fade back into the earth. But after the rituals were done, after the neighbors had returned to their own hearths and their own lives, the silence would return, deeper and more permanent. It was in the small moments of the day that this silence was most keenly felt. In the morning, there was no one to share the small piece of dark bread with. At noon, there was no one working alongside her in the village's great open fields. In the evening, as she sat by the fire, her hands busy with her spinning, the quiet was broken only by the crackle of the flames and the soft breathing of her sleeping children. This silence was not just emotional, it was deeply practical. It was the absence of his labor, his knowledge, his voice in the world outside the cottage door. Who would now mend the leaking thatch on the roof? Who would sharpen the sickle before the harvest? Who would speak for the family at the manorial court, or argue with the reeve, the Lord's official, over the tally of workdays owed? The silence was a constant reminder of her new vulnerability, of the half of her world that was now gone. It was the sound of her life, irrevocably and terrifyingly changed forever. In that quiet, smoky cottage, the peasant widow had to begin the slow, arduous task of learning to live a life of one. Once the initial shock of loss began to recede, it was replaced by the crushing and immediate weight of responsibility. For a peasant widow, the household was not simply a home. It was a small, fragile enterprise, and she was now its sole proprietor. The survival of her family rested entirely on her shoulders, on her ability to take on not only her own traditional tasks, but also the demanding physical and managerial roles that her husband had once filled. The burden was immense, a daily struggle against time, the elements, and the limits of her own strength. The center of her world was the small plot of land that came with the cottage, the toft and croft. This was her kingdom and her prison. The croft, a small kitchen garden, was already her domain. Here she cultivated the essential vegetables, peas, beans, onions, and cabbages that formed the backbone of the family's diet. She tended the precious herbs used for both cooking and medicine. This work, while familiar, now felt more urgent, more critical. Every cabbage, every handful of peas was one less thing to worry about, a small victory against the ever-present threat of hunger. Beside the cottage might be a small pen for a pig, or a coop for a few chickens. These animals were the family's most valuable assets. The pig, fed on scraps, represented a winter's supply of salted meat and fat. The chickens provided a steady, if meager, supply of eggs, a vital source of protein, and a small commodity that could be sold or bartered at the local market for a few precious coins. The care of these animals, feeding them, protecting them from foxes, keeping their shelters mended, now fell entirely to her. The loss of a single chicken was a minor disaster. The death of the pig was a catastrophe. But the greatest challenge lay beyond the familiar garden fence, in the great open fields of the manor. A peasant family's main livelihood came from the strips of land they were allotted to farm. This was where the grain, the wheat, rye, or barley that would become their bread was grown. This was the work that had been her husband's primary responsibility, a cycle of heavy, seasonal labor that required immense physical strength. In the spring, the fields had to be plowed. A peasant family might own an ox, or they might have to pool their resources with neighbors to form a team to pull the heavy, iron-tipped wooden plow through the dense, wet soil. A woman alone could not guide the plow and control a team of oxen by herself. She would have to rely on the charity of her neighbors, the help of a grown son if she was lucky, or if she had a little money,
she might have to hire a man to do the work. Each option came with a cost, either in social obligation or in scarce coin. After the plowing came the sowing of the seed, and then the long summer of weeding, a back-breaking task, often performed by women and children, but one that was now harder without a husband to share the family's total burden. The true test came at the harvest. The grain had to be cut with sickles or scythes, a strenuous, repetitive motion that could go on from dawn until dusk for weeks. The harvested grain then had to be bundled into sheaths, stacked to dry, and transported from the field. A widow had to perform her share of this labor, working alongside the other villagers, all while knowing that her family's entire food supply for the coming year depended on her efforts. Beyond the fields, the fabric of the household itself demanded constant attention. The wattle and daub walls of the cottage needed regular patching with a mixture of mud, straw, and dung to keep out the wind and rain. The thatched roof, a haven for mice and a constant fire risk, might need mending. Her husband's tools, his spade, his axe, his knife, would dull with use and need sharpening, a skill she would have to learn or pay for. The firewood that heated the cottage and cooked their food did not gather itself. It meant long treks into the Lord's woods to collect fallen branches, the right to which was known as estivor, a precious privilege that she had to guard. All of this was in addition to her own ceaseless round of chores, fetching water from the village well, grinding grain into flour with a heavy stone quern, baking the dark, dense bread over the open fire, mending the family's simple woolen clothes, and most pressingly, caring for her children. The burden of the household was a physical and mental weight that never lifted. From the moment she awoke in the cold pre-dawn darkness to the moment she collapsed onto her straw mattress at night, she was in a constant state of motion, a relentless struggle to hold her small world together with her own two hands.
Legal and economic struggles. For the medieval peasant widow, grief was a private sorrow, but her survival was a public, legal matter. Her entire future, her right to stay in her home and to work her land, was not guaranteed. It was subject to a complex and often bewildering web of laws and local customs dictated by the lord of the manor. Navigating this legal landscape without the support and representation of a husband was one of the most daunting challenges she faced. Her economic struggles were inextricably linked to her precarious legal standing. The central issue was the question of land. The cottage and the strips of land in the open fields were not owned by the peasant family. They were held from the lord of the manor in exchange for rent, paid in a combination of cash, produce, and, most significantly, labor service. The tenancy of this land was officially in the husband's name. Upon his death, the widow's right to remain was not automatic. It depended on the specific customs of the manor, which varied widely from one place to another. In many parts of England, a widow was entitled to what was known as her dower or free bench. This was her legal right to hold a portion of her late husband's land, often a third, sometimes as much as a half, for the remainder of her life, or until she remarried. This right was her most important economic protection. It provided her with a means of supporting herself and her children. However, this right was not always secure. It had to be formally claimed and recognized in the manorial court. The manorial court was the center of legal life in the village. It was presided over by the lord's steward or reeve, and its jury was made up of the other male tenants of the manor. For a grieving widow, appearing before this assembly of men to plead her case could be an intimidating ordeal. She had to present herself, announce her husband's death, and formally request that her right to the dower land be acknowledged. Before any land could be transferred, however, the lord had to be paid. A heriot, or death tax, was almost always due. This was a cruel and often crippling payment.
Custom dictated that the lord was entitled to take the deceased tenant's best beast, the family's only ox, its milk cow, or its strongest horse. For a widow, the loss of this asset was a devastating economic blow. It was the very asset she needed most to work the land she was trying to keep. The Harriet payment could push a family that was already on the brink of poverty over the edge. If there were adult sons, the situation became even more complicated. The land would typically pass to the eldest son, and the widow's dower would be carved out of his inheritance. This could create tension within the family, as the son might resent having to support his mother and give up a portion of the land he now considered his. If the children were young, the widow might be granted custody of the land as their guardian, but she would be accountable to the lord for its upkeep and for ensuring all labor services were performed. Her ability to perform these services was a constant concern for the lord. The manor's economy depended on the labor of its tenants. A widow, without the physical strength of a man, might struggle to fulfill the plowing and harvesting duties owed to the lord. This could put her tenancy in jeopardy. The lord or his reeve might put pressure on her to remarry quickly, not out of concern for her loneliness, but to ensure that there was an able-bodied man on the land to perform the required labor. Beyond the land, all of the family's movable goods, their pots and pans, their bedding, their few items of furniture, were also subject to legal claims. The debts that her husband had incurred now fell to her. If she could not pay, the bailiff could seize her possessions. She had to become, overnight, a shrewd manager of a household with no resources, constantly aware of her legal obligations and vulnerabilities. The legal system was not designed for her benefit. It was designed to protect the interests of the lord of the manor and to ensure the continuity of the agricultural economy. While custom did provide the widow with certain rights, they were fragile. She had to fight for them, to assert them in a public, male-dominated forum, all while navigating her own grief and the immense practical burdens of her new life. Her struggle for survival was, at its heart, a legal and economic one, played out in the shadow of the manor house.
Social expectations and isolation. The medieval village was a tightly knit community, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. This closeness could be a source of support, but it could also be a source of immense social pressure and scrutiny. When a woman became a widow, her place within this intricate social web shifted dramatically. She was no longer just one half of a couple. She was now a woman alone, a figure who attracted a complex mixture of pity, suspicion, and expectation. The weight of the community's gaze could be as heavy as any of her practical burdens, leading to a profound sense of isolation. Upon her husband's death, a widow was immediately cast in a new social role, one that was heavily defined by the church and by village custom. She was expected to be the pious widow, a figure of sober, chaste, and devout mourning. Her behavior was closely watched. She was expected to wear simple dark clothing, to avoid festivals and celebrations, and to devote herself to her children and to prayers for her late husband's soul. Any perceived deviation from this model, laughing too loudly, taking too much interest in a neighboring farmer, or failing to attend church regularly, could become the subject of village gossip. Gossip was the invisible currency of the village, a powerful force for enforcing social norms. A widow's reputation was her most valuable and most fragile asset. A good reputation, as a hard-working, pious, and respectable woman, could earn her the support and help of her neighbors. A tarnished reputation could lead to ostracism. The village women in particular would watch her interactions with men with a keen and often critical eye. She was seen as a potential threat to the stability of other marriages, a single woman in a world of couples. This suspicion could make it difficult for her to have normal, friendly interactions with men, even when she needed their help for practical tasks. This constant scrutiny could lead to a deep sense of loneliness. While she was surrounded by people, she was no longer fully a part of the social life of the village. The simple companionship she had shared with her husband was gone. The evenings by the fire were solitary. The small joys and sorrows of the day had no one to be shared with. Her grief was a private landscape that no one else could fully enter. Even her own children, consumed by their own loss, could not fill the void left by her partner. This isolation was not just emotional, it was also practical. Many of the social activities in the village were organized around couples and families. At church ales, weddings, and harvest festivals, she would now be a solitary figure. While a married woman could rely on her husband to be her partner and her advocate in public, a widow had to stand alone. She had to find her own voice, to speak for herself, a role that many women were not raised or prepared to take on. For older widows, especially those whose children had grown and left home, the isolation could be even more profound. An old woman living alone on the edge of the village was a figure of ambiguity. She might be respected for her wisdom and experience, sought out for her knowledge of herbs and healing, but she could also become an object of fear and superstition. If a neighbor's cow fell ill or a child was struck by a fever, suspicion might fall on the lonely old widow, who was rumored to have the evil eye or to mumble curses under her breath. This was the dark side of social isolation, where loneliness could curdle into marginalization and even persecution. The widow had to navigate this complex social world with great care. She had to perform the role of the grieving, respectable widow that the community expected of her, even if her internal feelings were more complicated, a mix of grief, fear, and perhaps even a flicker of relief from a difficult marriage. She had to be friendly, but not too friendly, pious, but not self-righteous, hard-working, but not too independent. She lived her life on a social tightrope, constantly balancing the need for community support against the risks of public judgment. In the crowded, intimate world of the medieval village, a widow could be lonelier than anyone.
Seeking support. A peasant widow standing alone in the face of immense legal, economic, and social challenges could not survive without help. While her new position was one of vulnerability, she was not entirely abandoned. There existed in the medieval village a web of potential support systems, fragile and conditional though they might be. Her survival often depended on her ability to skillfully weave together aid from three main sources: her own family, the broader community of her neighbors, and the parish church. The first and most important source of support was her own kin. If her parents were still alive and living in the same village, they might provide crucial assistance, offering food from their own stores, helping with childcare, or providing a strong male voice to speak for her. Her brothers, if she had any, could be a vital source of the male labor she now lacked, helping with the plowing or mending the cottage roof. This support, however, was not guaranteed. Her own family had their own households to run, their own mouths to feed. Their resources were limited, and their primary obligation was to their own immediate family unit. Her relationship with her late husband's family could be more complex. A supportive mother-in-law could be a great comfort and a source of wisdom. A brother-in-law might feel a sense of duty to help protect his brother's widow and children. However, this relationship could also be a source of conflict. Her husband's family might see the land she held as rightfully theirs, and they could resent her continued occupation of it. If she had no sons, they might put pressure on the lord of the manor to grant the tenancy to one of them, effectively dispossessing her. The support of in-laws was often a double-edged sword, a mixture of obligation and self-interest. Her own children were, of course, central to her life, but their ability to provide support depended on their age. Young children were another burden to be fed and cared for, though they could help with simple tasks like gathering firewood or scaring birds from the crops. An adult son was the greatest asset a widow could have. He could take over his father's role as the primary laborer, work the family's strips of land, and represent the household to the outside world. A widow with a grown son was in a far more secure position than one with only young children. Grown daughters, while helpful with domestic chores, would likely marry and leave the household, their primary loyalties shifting to their new husband's family. Beyond the family, the village community itself operated on a principle of reluctant but necessary cooperation. Neighbors understood that their own survival was tied to the survival of the village as a whole. They might help a widow with the harvest, knowing that her untended strips of land could become a haven for weeds that would spread to their own. A neighbor might lend her an ox for a day's plowing, in exchange for her help with weeding or spinning later on. This was a system of reciprocal aid, a constant low-level bartering of labor and resources. This communal support was informal and depended heavily on the widow's social standing. A well-liked and respected woman would find her neighbors more willing to help. A woman who was seen as lazy, quarrelsome, or immoral would find herself isolated, her requests for help quietly ignored. The women of the village were a particularly important network. They were the midwives who would help deliver children, the healers who knew which herbs to use for a fever, and the gossips who controlled the flow of information. A widow's integration into this female community was crucial for her day-to-day survival. The third pillar of support was the parish church. The church taught that charity, or caritas, was a Christian duty. It preached that caring for widows and orphans was a sacred obligation. The local priest might exhort his parishioners to be generous to the needy in their midst. The parish might have a small poor box or a fund collected from the congregation that could be used to provide a small dole of bread or grain to the most destitute, including poor widows. This charity, however, was often meager and highly conditional. It was reserved for the deserving poor, those who were seen as pious, humble, and morally upstanding. A widow who was perceived as anything less might be denied aid. The church's support was as much about enforcing social and moral control as it was about alleviating suffering. For the peasant widow, these networks of support were her lifeline, but they were lifelines that could fray or break. She had to constantly work to maintain them, to nurture her relationships with family and neighbors, and to uphold a pious reputation that would make her worthy of the church's charity. Her life was a constant delicate negotiation, seeking help without appearing helpless, accepting charity without sacrificing her dignity. In the end, the support she received was rarely enough to make her life easy, but it was often just enough to make it possible.
Widowhood and work. For a peasant woman in the Middle Ages, life was synonymous with work. Her days were a relentless cycle of tasks essential for her family's survival. When she became a widow, this reality did not change. It intensified. The volume of work increased dramatically, and its nature shifted. She now had to be both farmer and homemaker. Her body and her time stretched to their absolute limits. The daily toil of a peasant widow was a testament to human endurance, a story written in aching muscles, calloused hands, and the quiet determination to see another day through. Her day began before the sun, in the cold, dark quiet of the cottage. The first task was always the fire. She would have to coax the embers from the previous night back to life, or start a new flame with a precious flint and steel. The fire was the heart of the home, providing warmth, light, and the means to cook. Once the fire was going, she would prepare the day's first meal, a simple, meager affair, perhaps a piece of dark rye bread and a cup of small ale, a weak, low-alcohol beer that was often safer to drink than water. With the children fed, her own work began in earnest. If it was the season for planting or harvesting, she would head out to the manor's great fields to work her family's strips of land. This was the most physically demanding labor. We have heard of the plowing and harvesting, but there was also the back-breaking work of hoeing and weeding under the hot sun, of carrying heavy baskets of manure to fertilize the soil, and of defending the precious crops from birds and other pests. She worked alongside the other villagers, men and women, trying to keep pace, her every movement a struggle against the limitations of her own strength. She could not afford to fall behind, as the success of her harvest determined whether her family would eat through the winter. Back at the cottage, the work continued. The small garden plot, the croft, required constant attention, watering, weeding, and protecting the vegetables from insects. She would need to milk the family's goat or cow if they were fortunate enough to have one, and churn some of the milk into butter or cheese. The chickens needed to be fed and their eggs collected. These small products of her labor were vital. A little extra cheese or a few eggs could be taken to the weekly market and traded for salt, a new pot, or a small piece of iron to mend a broken tool. The inside of the cottage was a miniature factory. One of her most constant and essential tasks was spinning. Using a simple drop spindle, or in later periods, a spinning wheel, she would spend countless hours twisting raw wool or flax into thread. This thread was the raw material for the family's clothing. She might weave it herself on a small, simple loom, or she might provide the thread to the village weaver. Spinning was a task that could be done in the evenings, by the dim light of the fire, after a long day of physical labor in the fields. It was a tedious, repetitive motion, her hands almost never still. Food preparation was a constant, time-consuming process. Grain had to be milled into flour, often by hand, using a heavy stone quern, a task that was exhausting work for 2 arms. Then the flour had to be mixed with water and yeast, kneaded and baked into bread, either on the hot hearthstone of her own fire or in the Lord's communal oven, for which she would have to pay a fee. She would make pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew of grains and vegetables, which would often simmer over the fire all day, providing the main meal for the evening. And through it all, there were the children. She had to care for them, feed them, and keep them safe. While she worked in the fields, the older children would be tasked with watching the younger ones. She was her sole protector, her only source of comfort and discipline. The peasant widow's life was a litany of labor. There were no days off, no moments of true rest. Every waking hour was filled with a task that was essential for survival. Her work was not just a series of chores, it was a constant battle against entropy, against the forces of hunger, cold, and decay that threatened to overwhelm her small household. Her calloused hands, her aching back, and her weary bones were the physical record of her love and her will to endure. The unending rhythm of her work was the sound of her family's heart, beating on.
Remarriage and reputation. For a peasant widow, the decision of whether or not to remarry was one of the most significant and complex choices she would ever face. It was not simply a matter of the heart, of seeking new companionship or love. It was a strategic decision, weighed down with profound economic, legal, and social implications. The path she chose would be scrutinized by her family, her neighbors, and most importantly, by the lord of the manor. Her final decision and the reputation she maintained throughout the process would fundamentally shape the rest of her life. The pressure to remarry often came from above. The lord of the manor had a vested interest in the land she held. His primary concern was ensuring that the land was productive and that all the associated labor services were performed efficiently. In his eyes, a household run by a man was more stable and reliable than one run by a lone woman. Therefore, the lord or his reeve might actively encourage a widow to find a new husband, especially if she was young and had many years of work ahead of her. In some cases, the lord could claim the right to choose a husband for her, or to approve any suitor she might select. refusing a suitable match proposed by the Lord could be risky, potentially jeopardizing her tenancy. For the right to marry, she or her new husband would often have to pay the Lord a fee, known as a merchant. From the widow's own perspective, remarriage offered clear and compelling advantages. A new husband would bring his physical strength to the household, taking over the heavy agricultural labor that she struggled to manage. He would provide a measure of protection, both physically and legally, representing the family in the manorial court and dealing with the outside world. He would also bring an end to the profound loneliness of her widowhood, offering companionship and a partner to share the immense burdens of life. For a widow with young children, a new husband could provide a father figure and greater security for their future. The prospect of a complete family unit, of returning to the familiar and stable structure of a marriage, was a powerful allure. However, remarriage was also fraught with peril and potential loss. The greatest risk was to her independence and her property. While she was a widow, she was the head of her own household. She had a legal identity, the ability to hold land in her own right through her dower, and control over her own movable goods. The moment she remarried, all of this would change. Under the legal principle of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into that of her husband. Her property, her earnings, and even her children would legally fall under his control. A kind and responsible new husband could be a blessing, but a cruel, lazy, or spendthrift one could be a disaster, squandering the assets she had worked so hard to preserve. The interests of her children were another major consideration. A new husband might not treat her children from her first marriage with the same care and affection as his own. There was a real risk of conflict, especially over inheritance. Her children stood to inherit the land and goods from their father. A new stepmother might try to favor his own future children or simply misuse the inheritance for his own purposes. The folk tales and stories of the period are filled with the archetype of the cruel stepfather, a reflection of a very real social anxiety. A widow had to weigh the immediate benefits of remarriage against the potential long-term risks to her children's well-being and future. Throughout this process, her reputation was paramount. She had to navigate the delicate transition from the socially respected role of the pious widow to that of a woman seeking a new partner. She could not appear too eager to remarry, lest she be accused of disrespecting her late husband's memory, or of being driven by lust. She had to be discreet and modest. The choice of a new husband was also subject to intense community scrutiny. Marrying a man of lower social standing or one with a poor reputation could damage her own. Marrying a younger man could lead to gossip and ridicule. Some widows, particularly older women whose children were grown, might choose to remain single. They had fulfilled their duties of child-rearing and might value the independence and control over their own lives that widowhood, for all its hardships, afforded them. They could live out their days as respected elders in the community, free from the authority of a husband. This too was a valid choice, but one that required a degree of economic security that not all widows possessed. The decision was a fine balance of heart and head, of need and risk. It was a choice made in the full glare of public opinion, a deeply personal decision that had profound public consequences. Whether she chose the security of a new marriage or the hard-won independence of continued widowhood, her path was a difficult one, guided by the constant need to protect her family, her property, and her all-important reputation.
The role of religion. In the deeply religious world of medieval Europe, the experience of widowhood was inseparable from the teachings and rituals of the Christian Church. Faith was not a private matter, it was the framework that gave meaning to every aspect of life, from birth to death and beyond. For the peasant widow, the Church offered a complex mixture of profound solace, social identity, and a heavy burden of expectation. Her grief, her social standing, and her path forward were all shaped by the pervasive influence of her religious beliefs. The first and most immediate role of the church was to provide a structure for mourning. The rituals surrounding death and burial were designed to guide the grieving family and the community through the transition. The priest's presence at the deathbed, the administration of the last rites, and the funeral mass were all intended to ensure the safe passage of the husband's soul into the next life. This was of paramount importance to the widow. The central concern of a medieval Christian was the fate of their immortal soul, and the belief in purgatory, a place where souls were cleansed of their sins before entering heaven, was universal. A widow's most sacred duty, therefore, was to pray for her husband's soul. It was believed that the prayers of those left behind could shorten the time a soul spent in purgatory. The widow would attend Mass, light candles, and offer her own private prayers for her husband's salvation. If she had the means, however small, she might pay the priest to say a special Mass for the deceased on the anniversary of his death. This spiritual labor was a continuation of her marital bond, a final act of care for her husband that extended beyond the grave. It gave her a sense of purpose in her grief and a tangible way to express her enduring love and loyalty. Beyond ritual, the church offered a powerful source of comfort. The promise of the resurrection and the belief that she would one day be reunited with her husband in heaven provided a profound solace in the face of devastating loss. Sermons that spoke of suffering on earth as a test of faith and of the rewards that awaited the righteous in the next life could help a widow to endure her hardships with a sense of divine purpose. The story of Christ's suffering and the sorrows of the Virgin Mary provided models of graceful endurance, figures with whom she could identify in her own grief. The physical space of the parish church itself, cool, dark, and quiet, could be a refuge from the toils and troubles of her daily life, a place for peaceful contemplation. However, the church also placed a heavy weight of expectation upon the widow. The ideal widow, as portrayed in sermons and religious texts, was a model of piety, chastity, and quiet devotion. St. Paul's epistles, which were frequently cited, praised widows who dedicated their lives to prayer and good works. This created a specific and highly respected social category for the widow, but it was a demanding one. She was expected to live a life almost like that of a nun in the world, renouncing worldly pleasures and dedicating herself to God. This idealization of chaste widowhood meant that the decision to remarry was viewed with some ambivalence by the church. While it was permitted, it was often seen as a spiritually inferior choice, a concession to the needs of the flesh rather than a pursuit of a higher, holier path. A widow who chose to remarry was seen as turning away from the special spiritual status that her widowhood had conferred upon her. This could create a sense of guilt or conflict for a woman who felt both the social and economic pressure to remarry and the religious pressure to remain single and chaste. The local parish priest was a powerful figure in the widow's life. He was her spiritual guide, the man she would turn to for confession and advice. A kind and compassionate priest could be a source of immense support, but a harsh or judgmental one could add to her burdens, scrutinizing her behavior and holding her to an impossible standard of piety. In essence, religion provided the language through which a peasant widow understood her experience. Her loss was not a random tragedy, but an act of God's will. Her suffering was not meaningless, but a path to spiritual growth. Her future was not just a matter of earthly survival, but also of eternal salvation. This framework could be a source of incredible strength and resilience, giving her the fortitude to face a life of hardship. But it was also a rigid and demanding framework, one that defined her identity and constrained her choices in ways that were both profound and inescapable.
Childcare and loss. For a peasant widow, the presence of her children was both her greatest comfort and her most profound responsibility. They were the living legacy of her marriage, a tangible link to the husband she had lost. But they were also small, vulnerable beings who now depended on her for everything. The challenge of raising children alone while simultaneously navigating her own deep grief and the crushing demands of survival was perhaps the most emotionally and practically taxing aspect of her new life. In the immediate aftermath of their father's death,
A widow had to become the sole emotional anchor for her children. They too were grieving, but in a world that had little language for the inner life of a child, their sorrow was often overlooked. A widow had to manage her own heartbreak while trying to explain the inexplicable to her young ones. She had to comfort their fears and answer their questions in a way that was honest but not terrifying. The sight of their confusion and sadness would have been a constant, painful echo of her own loss. The practicalities of childcare were relentless. A widow with an infant or a toddler was in a particularly difficult position. She could not leave a young child alone while she went to work in the distant fields. She would either have to carry the child with her, strapping them to her back as she bent to her work, or she would have to rely on an older child or a willing neighbor to watch them. Every option was a compromise, a constant juggling of needs. As children grew, they transitioned from being a pure burden of care to being a source of labor. From a very young age, children in a peasant household were expected to contribute. A 5-year-old could be tasked with scaring crows from the garden, gathering fallen twigs for the fire, or watching over the family's chickens. An older child could help with weeding, milking the goat, or carrying water from the well. For a widow, the labor of her children was not a convenience, it was a necessity. She had to train them, direct them, and rely on them in a way that would have been shared with her husband before. She was now the sole manager of this small family workforce. This reliance on child labor was born of desperation, and it came at a cost. Children who had to work long hours had little time for play, their childhoods cut short by the harsh realities of their family's situation. A widow would have felt the weight of this, the silent grief of not being able to provide her children with a more carefree existence. The future of her children was a constant gnawing anxiety. For her sons, she had to worry about their inheritance. Would she be able to hold on to the family's land long enough for them to inherit it? Would she be able to provide the Harriet payment to the Lord when the time had come for her eldest son to take over the tenancy? She had to teach him the skills of a farmer, the knowledge that his father would have passed down. For her daughters, she had to worry about their marriage prospects. A daughter from a poor, fatherless family was at a disadvantage. A widow would have to scrape together a small dowry, perhaps a pot, some bedding, or a young pig, to make her daughter an attractive match. The future security of her children depended entirely on her ability to navigate the present. The emotional dynamic within the family was also profoundly changed. A widow with an adolescent son might find herself in a difficult position. As he grew into a young man, he might begin to challenge her authority, feeling that he should be the head of the household. She had to learn to manage this delicate transition, to guide him towards responsibility without creating conflict. In every decision she made, whether to sell the family's pig, whether to remarry, whether to take on extra work, the needs of her children were paramount. They were her motivation, the reason she got up in the cold dawn and worked until her body ached. In their faces, she saw the face of her lost husband. In their survival, she found the purpose for her own. The bond between a peasant widow and her children was forged in the crucible of loss and hardship, a testament to a mother's fierce, quiet, and endless love in a world that offered them very little.
Widows' property rights. The small, smoky cottage, the muddy garden plot, the few strips of land in the village fields, these were not just places. For a peasant widow, they were the very foundation of her existence. Her right to this property, however, was a fragile and complicated thing, governed not by a clear universal law, but by a patchwork of local customs that rarely put her interests first. The struggle to hold on to her home and her livelihood was a constant legal battle, fought with little more than her own resilience and a deep knowledge of her community's traditions.
As we have heard, a peasant did not own his land outright. He held it as a tenant of the local lord. The widow's claim to this property after her husband's death was therefore not an inheritance in the modern sense, but a customary right to continue the tenancy. The most important of these rights was her dower, known in many English manners as freebench. This was her entitlement to a portion of the family holding for her own use. The size of this portion varied enormously. In some manors, it was a third of the land. In others, a half. In a few remarkably generous places, she might have the right to the entire holding for the rest of her life, as long as she remained chaste and did not remarry. This right to freebench was the single most important legal protection a peasant widow possessed. It was her shield against destitution. But it was a right that had to be actively claimed and defended. Upon her husband's death, she had to go before the manorial court. There, in a room full of the male tenants who made up the jury, and before the Lord Steward, she would have to perform a small ceremony. She might have to pay a small fee to enter her claim, and perhaps swear an oath of fealty to the Lord. The court would then formally grant her the land, and the transaction would be recorded in the manor's court roll, the official legal record of the village. This public recognition was vital. However, her hold on the property was almost always conditional. The most common condition was that she not remarry. The moment she took a new husband, her dower rights were typically extinguished. The land would then revert to her children, if they were of age, or directly back to the Lord. This created a powerful disincentive to remarry, forcing her to choose between the potential security of a new partner and the guaranteed security of her own land. Another common condition was chastity. A widow who was found to be unchaste, who had a relationship or especially a child outside of marriage, could forfeit her land. This was a powerful tool of social control, enforced by the watchful eyes of the community. A rumor or an accusation, whether true or not, could be enough to bring her before the court to defend her home and her reputation. Beyond the land itself were the movables, the family's personal possessions. This included everything from the cooking pot over the fire and the straw-filled mattresses to the farm animals and tools. In theory, these belonged to the widow and her children. However, they were vulnerable. The Lord's claim to the Harriet, the best beast, was the first and most damaging loss. After that, any debts her husband had left behind had to be paid. A creditor could make a claim in the manorial court for payment, and if the widow could not pay in cash, the court could order the seizure and sale of her personal goods. She could watch as her family's precious few assets were carried away, leaving her with almost nothing. The widow's best defense in this precarious legal world was her knowledge and her community. She needed to know the specific customs of her manor inside and out. She needed to have a reputation as an honest and hard-working woman, which would make the jury of her neighbors more inclined to support her claims. She might rely on a male relative, a brother or an adult son, to speak for her in court, as a man's voice often carried more weight. The property rights of a peasant widow were a study in fragility. They offered a measure of protection, a foothold in a world that could easily cast her out. But it was a foothold that could crumble away at any moment, under the pressure of the Lord's demands, the weight of debt, or the judgment of her neighbors. Her struggle to keep her property was the quiet, constant struggle for the right to simply stay put, to keep a roof over her children's heads, and to hold on to the last vestiges of the life she had once known.
Poverty and charity. For a great many peasant widows, the loss of a husband was the first step on a swift and certain path to poverty. The fragile economic balance of the peasant household, already precarious, was often shattered by the death of its primary male laborer. Without his income, without his strength, and burdened by legal fees and death taxes, a widow and her children could quickly fall into a state of profound destitution. Their survival would then depend on the thin and often unreliable lifeline of charity. The slide into poverty was a slow and painful process of attrition. It began with the Harriet payment, the loss of the family's best animal, which immediately crippled the household's productive capacity. Without an ox to plow, the widow would have to rely on neighbors, incurring social debts she might struggle to repay. The next stage often involved selling off the family's meager assets. A pig might be sold to pay off a debt, a few chickens sold for cash to buy grain. The family's few valuable possessions, a good woolen cloak, a metal pot, a sturdy tool, would be sold or bartered away one by one. The widow would watch as her household was stripped down to its barest essentials, each sale a small defeat in the war against hunger. As her resources dwindled, her labor became her only currency. She would seek out whatever paid work she could find. She might hire herself out to more prosperous neighbors to help with their harvest, receiving a small portion of the grain in return. She might take in extra spinning or weaving from other village women. One of the most common forms of labor for poor widows was gleaning. After the main harvest was complete, the very poor were traditionally allowed to go into the fields and gather any stray ears of grain that had been left behind. It was back-breaking work for a very small reward, but those few handfuls of grain could mean the difference between a meal and an empty belly. When even these efforts were not enough, the widow had to turn to begging. This was the ultimate humiliation, a public admission of her complete destitution. She might stand by the church door on a Sunday, her children beside her, hoping for a coin or a piece of bread from those attending Mass. She might go from door to door in the village, a practice known as thigging in some regions, relying on the charity of her neighbors. The primary institution responsible for organized charity was the parish church. The Christian duty of caritas compelled the community to care for its deserving poor. This category explicitly included widows and orphans. The parish might maintain a poor box, and the funds collected could be distributed by the priest or the church wardens. This relief, however, was rarely sufficient. It might amount to a loaf of bread a week or a small measure of grain. It was enough to prevent outright starvation, but not enough to live on. This charity was also highly conditional. To be considered deserving, a widow had to be seen as pious, humble, and morally upright. She had to attend church regularly and live a life free of any scandal. The dispensers of charity, the priest, and the leading men of the village were also the arbitrators of her moral worth. Charity was a tool of social control. A widow who was deemed troublesome or ungrateful could find her support cut off. She had to perform her poverty in a way that was acceptable to her benefactors, swallowing her pride and expressing constant gratitude for the scraps she received. In some larger towns, there might be a hospital or an almshouse, an institution founded by a wealthy patron or a guild to care for the sick and the elderly poor. A destitute widow might seek refuge in such a place, but there were very few of them, and they could only accommodate a tiny fraction of the needy. For most peasant widows, there was no institutional safety net. The reality of poverty was a constant, grinding hardship. It was the gnawing feeling of hunger, the biting cold of a winter night in a cottage with no firewood, the shame of seeing your children in ragged clothes. It was a life lived on the very edge of existence, where a small illness or a harsh winter could be a final, fatal blow. For the peasant widow, poverty was not just a lack of money, it was a state of profound vulnerability, a daily struggle for survival in a world that had very little to spare.
Social stigma and superstition. In the close-knit, often fearful world of the medieval village, anyone who stood apart from the norm could become an object of suspicion. For the peasant widow, her very status as a woman living without the authority and protection of a man made her different. While this could elicit pity and support, it could also attract a more sinister kind of attention. The widow, particularly if she was old and isolated, existed on the social margins, and it was on these margins that the dark flowers of superstition and stigma could grow. A widow's independence, however limited,
could be unsettling to the patriarchal order of the village. As a female head of household, she had a degree of autonomy that married women did not. This could be viewed with distrust. Her actions were not mediated by a husband, they were her own. This made her something of an unknown quantity, a person whose motives and behavior were not easily understood or controlled by the male-dominated power structure. This vague unease could sharpen into specific accusations, especially when misfortune struck the village. Medieval life was precarious. Crops could fail, livestock could sicken and die, and children could be struck down by mysterious illnesses. In an age before scientific understanding, people sought explanations for these calamities not in biology or weather patterns, but in the supernatural. They looked for a cause, and often for someone to blame. The isolated, eccentric old woman living by herself at the edge of the village was an easy and convenient target. The figure of the crone, or the hag, is a powerful archetype in folklore, and it was often the elderly widow who was forced into this role. She might be accused of having the evil eye, the power to cause harm with the malevolent glare. If a neighbor's cow suddenly stopped giving milk after the old widow had walked past it, the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, after this, therefore because of this, would take hold. It was not a coincidence, it was witchcraft. She might be accused of muttering curses, of using her knowledge of herbs not for healing, but for malevolent magic, or maleficium. A simple poultice she had made for a neighbor's ache, if it failed to work, could be reinterpreted as a deliberate act of harm. Her solitary walks to gather herbs in the woods could be seen as secret journeys to meet with dark forces. Her pet cat, her only companion, could be suspected of being a familiar, a demonic spirit in animal form. These suspicions were fueled by gossip and fear. A harsh word she had spoken in anger, a dispute over a wandering chicken. These small everyday conflicts could be retrospectively twisted into evidence of her malevolence. People would begin to avoid her, to cross themselves when she passed. Children would be warned to stay away from her cottage. This social ostracism would deepen her isolation, which in turn would make her seem even more strange and suspicious, creating a vicious cycle. While the great witch hunts were more a feature of the early modern period, the underlying beliefs and fears were firmly rooted in the medieval mindset. A widow accused of witchcraft in a medieval village would likely be brought before the manorial court or the church court. The evidence against her would be flimsy, the testimony of frightened or malicious neighbors. But in a climate of fear, it could be enough. The punishment might be a public penance, an expulsion from the village, or in the most extreme cases, a death sentence. Even if she was never formally accused, the stigma could be a heavy burden. The knowledge that she was viewed with suspicion would have been a source of constant anxiety. She would have to be careful about every word she spoke, every glance she gave. She had to project an image of harmlessness and piety to counteract the community's latent fear. This social stigma was the dark underbelly of the widow's experience. It was the price she paid for her marginality. In a world that craved order and conformity, her solitary, independent status was an anomaly, and in the face of unexplainable misfortune, the village sometimes needed a scapegoat to absorb its fear and anger. All too often, it was the lonely, vulnerable figure of the peasant widow who was forced to bear that terrible weight.
Widows in the legal system. The medieval legal system was overwhelmingly a man's world. Laws were made by men, enforced by men, and interpreted by men. In the courtroom, whether it was the king's court or the humble manorial court of the village, the voices that mattered were male. Yet, within this patriarchal structure, the widow occupied a unique and ambiguous legal position. The death of her husband, while devastating in many ways, paradoxically granted her a legal status that most women never possessed, that of a femme sole, a woman alone.
As the head of her household, she could, and often had to, engage directly with the law, appearing in court as both a plaintiff and a defendant. A married woman, a femme convert, had no independent legal identity. She was covered by her husband. If she was owed a debt, her husband had to sue for it. If she committed a minor crime, her husband was held responsible. She could not make contracts, own land in her own name, or bring a lawsuit. But when her husband died, this legal covering was removed. The widow stepped out from his shadow and became, in the eyes of the law, an independent actor. This was a double-edged sword, offering her a degree of agency while exposing her to a host of new dangers. Her most common appearances in the manorial court were, as we have seen, related to her property. She had to appear to claim her dower rights, to pay the Harriet fee, and to swear fealty to the Lord. These were foundational acts, establishing her new legal identity as a tenant of the manor. But her interactions with the court did not end there. As a landholder, she was now responsible for all the obligations that came with it. If her pig wandered into a neighbor's garden and damaged their crops, she could be sued for damages. If she failed to pay the small cash rent owed to the Lord, she would be summoned to court to answer for her debt. She also had the right to use the court to protect her own interests. If a neighbor's cattle strayed onto her strips of land and ate her growing grain, she could bring a suit against them. If someone owed her money for ale she had brewed or cloth she had woven, she could sue to recover the debt. In these instances, the widow would have to stand before the court and make her case. While she could ask a male relative to speak for her, many records from manorial courts show widows speaking for themselves, presenting their evidence and arguing their case with a surprising degree of confidence. For a peasant woman who was so often silenced and subservient, this was a rare opportunity to have a public voice. The court records reveal the myriad of small conflicts that made up village life, and the widow was often at their center. She might be fined for raising the hue and cry without just cause, or for brawling with a neighbor. She might be presented by the ale tasters, the village officials who checked the quality and price of ale, for brewing weak beer or for charging too much. These records paint a picture of women who were not passive victims, but active participants in the legal and economic life of their community, fighting for their rights and defending their interests in the only forum available to them. Of course, the system was heavily weighted against her. The steward, the reeve, and the jury were all men, who may have shared a prejudice that women were untrustworthy or overly emotional. A lone woman arguing against a man might find it difficult to get a fair hearing. She lacked the network of male allies that her opponent might have. She had to be more prepared, her case more solid, to have a hope of winning. Despite these disadvantages, the legal agency of the widow was a significant feature of medieval life. It provided her with a mechanism, however flawed, to seek justice and to protect her fragile economic position. Her presence in the court records is a testament to her resilience. It shows us a woman who was not just a grieving, pitiable figure, but a legal entity, a landholder, a business person, and a litigant. In the formal, ritualized world of the manorial court, the peasant widow found a space where she had to be acknowledged, where her name was written down, and where her voice, however small, had to be heard.
Widowhood and community. While the experience of a peasant widow was often marked by isolation and hardship, it is a mistake to imagine her as a complete outcast. The medieval village, for all its suspicions and judgments, was fundamentally a community. A widow, though her status had changed, remained a part of this intricate social fabric. She continued to participate in the life of the village, contributing in ways that were both expected and respected. In the spaces between her struggles, she found ways to maintain her connections, to offer her own skills, and to affirm her place within the world she had always known. One of the most important roles a widow, particularly an older one, could play was that of a healer or midwife. In a time before professional doctors were available to the peasantry, medical care was the domain of the village women. They were the keepers of traditional knowledge about herbs and remedies, passed down through generations. A widow, with a lifetime of experience in caring for her own family, was often a trusted source of this wisdom. Neighbors would come to her seeking a poultice for a wound, a syrup for a cough, or a tonic to soothe a fever. Her garden, filled with medicinal herbs, was a kind of village pharmacy. The role of the midwife, or good wife, was especially crucial. Childbirth was a dangerous and exclusively female event, and experienced older women were essential to its success. A widow who had borne several children of her own would be called upon to assist at births, to offer comfort and guidance to the laboring mother, and to welcome the new life into the community. These roles as healer and midwife gave her a position of immense respect and importance. She was a guardian of life and health, a source of practical, essential knowledge. Widows also played a central role in the rituals of death. Just as they helped to bring life into the world, they helped to usher it out. It was often the older women of the village who were responsible for the laying out of the dead, washing the body, shrouding it, and preparing it for burial. This was a solemn and vital task, a final act of care for a departed neighbor. This intimacy with the great transitions of life and death gave the widow a unique, almost sacred status within the community. Beyond these specialized roles, widows were participants in the everyday social and economic life of the village. They were a common sight at the weekly market, selling their surplus eggs, cheese, or ale. This was not just a commercial transaction, it was a social one. The market was a place to exchange news and gossip, to maintain friendships, and to stay connected to the flow of village life. The church was another important center of community, and widows were often its most devout and active members. They would attend Mass regularly, participate in religious processions, and help to maintain the church building, perhaps by cleaning it or mending its altar cloths. The parish church was one of the few public spaces where a woman could participate on an equal footing, her piety earning her the same respect as anyone else's. Widows were also part of the informal social networks of women. While men might gather in the tavern or at the forge, women's social lives were centered on the spaces where they worked together, at the village well while drawing water, in the fields during the harvest, or in each other's cottages during long evenings of spinning. In these spaces, they shared information, offered advice, and provided emotional support. A widow was an integral part of this gossip network, which served as a powerful system of communication and solidarity among the village women. Of course, her participation was always conditioned by her status. She had to be careful to maintain her reputation and to never step too far outside the bounds of what was considered appropriate behavior for a widow. But within those bounds, she could and did lead a rich social life. She was not simply a passive recipient of the community's judgment or charity. She was an active contributor, a keeper of traditions, a source of vital skills, and a knowing, experienced member of the village. Her presence enriched the community, a quiet, steady thread in the complex tapestry of medieval life. Mourning and memory. For the peasant widow, grief was not a private emotion to be experienced in solitude. It was a public performance, a set of rituals and expectations that structured her experience of loss. Mourning in the medieval period was a communal affair, guided by the teachings of the church and the customs of the village. It was a process through which the widow both honored the memory of her husband and redefined her own identity in the eyes of the community. This journey through grief was a delicate balance between personal sorrow and public duty. The period of mourning began immediately after the funeral. Custom, reinforced by the church, dictated that a widow should enter a prescribed period of intense grieving. During this time, which could last for 40 days, a year, or even longer, she was expected to withdraw from the more joyous aspects of village life. She would not attend weddings, festivals, or celebratory church ales. Her public demeanor was expected to be one of sobriety and sorrow. Laughter or any display of high spirits would be seen as a sign of disrespect to her late husband's memory. Her clothing became a visible symbol of her grief. while a peasant widow could not afford the elaborate black mourning clothes of the nobility, she was expected to adopt a simple and somber appearance. She would wear clothes made of coarse, undyed wool in shades of dark brown, gray, or black. Her attire would be plain, free of any ornamentation. Most significantly, she would adopt a distinctive head covering, such as a wimple or a veil, that covered her hair and signified her new status as a chaste and pious widow. This uniform of grief marked her out, signaling her role to all who saw her and constantly reminding her of the loss she had endured. The central focus of her mourning was the spiritual well-being of her husband. As we have heard, her most important duty was to pray for his soul, to help ease its journey through purgatory. This was not just a spiritual exercise, it was an act of memory. Through her prayers, she kept her husband's presence alive. She would recall his virtues, ask forgiveness for his sins, and maintain her connection to him through this ongoing spiritual conversation. The parish priest would guide her in this, reminding her of the importance of her intercessions. Remembering the date of her husband's death was crucial. On the 1-month anniversary, the month's mind, and the 1-year anniversary, the year's mind, she would make a special effort to honor his memory. If she could afford it, she would pay the priest to say a mass for his soul. She might also give a small charitable donation of food or ale to the poor of the village in her husband's name. This act of charity was believed to gain spiritual merit for the deceased. These anniversaries were public rituals of remembrance, moments when the community would join the widow in recalling the man who had been lost. Beyond these formal rituals, the widow's grief was woven into the fabric of her daily life. Every object in her small cottage, his chair, his tools, the cup he drank from, was a vessel of memory. Every task she now performed alone was a reminder of his absence. The process of mourning was a slow and gradual one, a process of learning to live with this emptiness. Her personal memory of her husband might have been more complex than the idealized image she presented to the world. She would remember not just his virtues, but also his flaws, not just the happy times, but also the arguments and hardships. Her private grief was a rich and nuanced landscape, filled with a complex tapestry of emotions, sorrow, love, perhaps anger, and even in some cases, a sense of release. But this private reality had to be concealed behind the public mask of the pious, grieving widow. Over time, the intensity of the formal mourning would lessen. She might gradually re-engage with the social life of the village. Her clothing might become less severe, but she would always be a widow, her identity forever shaped by her loss. The memory of her husband would become a quiet, foundational part of who she was. The rituals of mourning provided a path through the initial overwhelming chaos of grief, channeling her sorrow into a set of meaningful actions. They allowed her to perform her love and loyalty in a way her community could understand and respect, and in doing so, to slowly, painstakingly build a new life from the ashes of the old.
Widows and trade. In the struggle for economic survival, the peasant widow had to be resourceful. With her primary source of household income gone, she had to find new ways to earn the few precious coins needed for rent, taxes, and goods she could not produce herself. While her opportunities were limited, many widows managed to transform their traditional domestic skills into small-scale commercial enterprises. They became traders and craftswomen, active participants in the local economy. Their resilience and ingenuity a quiet testament to their will to provide for their families. The most common and accessible trade for a widow was brewing ale. In the medieval village, ale was a staple of the diet, consumed by men, women, and children. It was nutritious, calorie-rich, and often safer than the local water. While most households brewed their own small ale for domestic use, the production of stronger, better quality ale for sale was a specialized trade, and one that was dominated by women.
A woman who brewed ale for sale was known as an alewife or a brewster. A widow with a knack for brewing could turn her cottage into a small, informal tavern. She would put a sign outside, often a simple pole decorated with leaves or flowers, known as an ale stake, to announce that a new batch was ready. Neighbors would come to her home to drink, or they would bring their own jugs to be filled. This provided her with a small but steady cash income. However, the trade was regulated. The village ale tasters would regularly check the quality and price of her product. If her ale was found to be weak, or if she was accused of using false measures, she could be fined in the manorial court. Despite the risks, being an alewife was one of the most common and profitable occupations for a widow. Spinning and weaving were other essential domestic skills that could be turned to profit. A widow would spend countless hours at her drop spindle or spinning wheel producing woolen or linen thread. While much of this thread was for her own family's use, any surplus could be sold to the village weaver or directly to merchants. A woman who owned her own loom could take this a step further, weaving her thread into cloth for sale. This work was painstaking and poorly paid, but it was work that could be done within the home, allowing her to supervise her children at the same time. The weekly village market was the main arena for the widow's economic activities. Here she could set up a small stall or simply lay out a cloth on the ground to sell the surplus from her small household economy. She might sell eggs from her chickens, cheese and butter from her goat or cow, or vegetables and herbs from her garden. These small transactions, a few pennies at a time, would add up, providing the cash needed to buy salt, iron goods, or other necessities. The market was a competitive and noisy place, but it offered a vital connection to the cash economy. Some widows might continue a trade that they had learned from their late husbands. The widow of a baker might try to continue baking bread for sale, though she might have to hire a man to help with the heavy work of kneading. The widow of a chandler might continue to make and sell tallow candles. In the guilds of the larger towns, it was sometimes possible for a widow to carry on her husband's business and even hold his place in the guild, at least for a time. For a peasant widow, however, these opportunities were far more informal and precarious. These economic activities gave the widow a degree of agency and independence. She was not just a passive victim of her circumstances, she was an economic actor, a small-scale entrepreneur. Her work required a range of skills, not just brewing or spinning, but also bookkeeping, bargaining, and managing her reputation as an honest tradeswoman. Of course, her enterprise was always fragile. A poor harvest could mean no surplus grain for brewing. A disease could wipe out her chickens. An increase in the price of wool could make her spinning unprofitable. She was always operating on the thinnest of margins with no safety net. But her engagement in trade was a powerful symbol of her resilience. It was a demonstration of her ability to adapt, to find value in her own skills, and to carve out a small space of economic independence in a world that was designed to keep her dependent.
Widowhood in different regions. The experience of a peasant widow in the Middle Ages was not monolithic. While the core challenges of loss, labor, and loneliness were universal, the specific legal and cultural landscape she had to navigate could vary significantly from one region of Europe to another. The customs of an English manor were different from those of a French village or a German estate. These regional variations in law and social structure created a diverse tapestry of widowhood with different degrees of security, autonomy, and opportunity. In much of England, the legal system was based on common law, and the widow's primary protection, as we have seen, was her right to dower or free bench. This entitled her to a life interest in a portion, typically 1/3, of her husband's lands. This was a personal right belonging to her alone. Upon her death, the dower lands would pass to her husband's heirs. This system provided a widow with a means of support, but it also clearly separated her property from the main family inheritance, which could sometimes create tension with her children, particularly her eldest son. In contrast, in many parts of France, especially in the south, legal customs were more influenced by Roman law. Here, the concept of community property was more common. Under this system, the property and assets acquired by a couple during their marriage were considered to belong to them jointly. Upon the husband's death, the widow was not just entitled to a small portion, she often had rights to half of the entire community property. This could give her a greater degree of economic power and control than her English counterpart. She was not just a life tenant on her husband's land, she was a co-owner of the marital estate. This could put her in a stronger negotiating position both with her children and with the lord of the manor. In the vast and fragmented territories of the Holy Roman Empire, which covered much of modern-day Germany, the situation was even more varied. Legal customs were intensely local, changing from one lordship to the next. In some areas, a system similar to the English dower prevailed. In others, a widow's rights were much more limited, and she might be left almost entirely dependent on the goodwill of her children or the lord of the manor. The power of the local lord was often more absolute in German-speaking lands, and a widow's ability to hold on to her land could depend heavily on his personal whim. The pressure to remarry also varied by region. In areas of high population density and land scarcity, like the lowlands, lords were especially keen to ensure that every plot of land was worked by an able-bodied man. Here the pressure on widows to remarry quickly could be intense. In more sparsely populated regions, or in areas where pastoral farming was more common than intensive agriculture, a widow might face less pressure, as her labor alone might be sufficient to manage the family's holdings. Religious institutions also played different roles in different regions. In the lowlands, for example, the Beguine movement was particularly strong. Beguinages were semi-monastic communities of lay women who lived together, dedicating their lives to prayer and charitable work without taking formal vows. These communities provided a respectable and supportive alternative to marriage for many widows, especially those in towns. This option was far less common in other parts of Europe. Even the emotional and cultural expression of widowhood could differ. The ideal of the chaste, pious widow was a common theme throughout Christendom, but its emphasis could change. In the Mediterranean world, with its strong cultural emphasis on family honor, the behavior of a widow was subject to particularly intense scrutiny from her male relatives who saw her reputation as a reflection on the entire family. These regional differences remind us that the medieval peasant widow was not a single uniform character. She was a woman whose life was shaped by the specific soil of her own local world. The laws that governed her property, the economic pressures she faced, and the social options available to her were all drawn from a deep well of local custom. While the fundamental human experience of loss was the same across the map, the path a widow walked in its aftermath was charted by the unique geography of her own small corner of the medieval world.
Widow's dress and appearance. In the visual symbolic world of the Middle Ages, clothing was a language. It communicated a person's status, wealth, occupation, and moral standing. For the peasant widow, her dress was a particularly powerful statement. It was a public declaration of her grief, a symbol of her new social identity, and a constant, tangible reminder of the expectations placed upon her. Her appearance was not a matter of personal taste. It was a uniform, carefully prescribed by custom and designed to project an image of piety, modesty, and sorrow. The most striking feature of a widow's attire was its lack of color. In a world where dyes were expensive and vibrant colors were a sign of wealth and celebration, the widow was expected to retreat into a palette of sobriety. Her garments would be made of coarse, homespun wool, left in its natural, undyed shades of grey or brown, or dyed with simple, inexpensive botanicals to produce a dull, dark color, often referred to as black. This rejection of color was a visual representation of her withdrawal from the joys of worldly life, a sign that she was in a state of mourning. The cut of her clothing was also deliberately simple and modest. She would wear a long kirtle or gown that covered her from neck to ankle, with long sleeves that concealed her arms. The fit would be loose, designed to hide the shape of her body rather than accentuate it. Any form of decoration, embroidery, fine trim, or fashionable accessories was strictly forbidden. Her appearance was meant to be self-effacing, to draw as little attention to her physical self as possible. This was a visual manifestation of the ideal of chastity and humility that she was expected to embody. Perhaps the most significant and symbolic part of her costume was her head covering. For a woman in medieval society, her hair was a powerful symbol of her femininity and sexuality. A married woman would cover her hair in public as a sign of her marital status, but a widow's headwear was even more concealing and elaborate. She would often wear a wimple, a piece of cloth that was draped around the head, neck, and chin, framing the face while completely hiding the hair and throat. Over this, she might wear a veil. This complex arrangement of cloth served to desexualize her appearance, presenting her to the world as a figure of chaste widowhood, more akin to a nun than a secular woman. This prescribed widow's weed, as the mourning garments were known, served multiple purposes. For the widow herself, the act of putting on these clothes each morning was a physical embodiment of her grief, a daily ritual that reinforced her new identity. The rough feel of the wool and the restrictive nature of the wimple were constant sensory reminders of her loss and her altered place in the world. For the community, her appearance was a clear and unambiguous signal. It told them how to interact with her. Her sober dress commanded a degree of respect and pity, and it discouraged unwanted advances from men. It was a visual "do not disturb" sign, protecting her reputation and her emotional state. It ensured that she was seen first and foremost as a widow, her entire identity subsumed into this one defining characteristic. The duration for which a widow was expected to wear these mourning clothes varied. A period of at least a year and a day was common. Some deeply pious widows, particularly older women with no intention of remarrying, might choose to wear them for the rest of their lives, adopting them as a permanent uniform of their devotion to God and to the memory of their husband. Of course, the reality for a poor peasant widow might have been simpler. She likely owned very few sets of clothes and could not afford to set aside a special wardrobe for mourning. Her version of mourning dress might have been to simply wear her oldest, most patched garment, or to dye a familiar kirtle a dark colour using soot or walnut husks. But the principle remained the same. Her appearance was expected to reflect her inner state and her outer social role. The widow's clothing was, in essence, a cage of cloth, a set of visual rules that confined her, but it was also a shield. It was a way of managing public perception, of demanding respect, and of carving out a protected, if sombre, social space for herself. In her dark, simple garments, the peasant widow walked through her world, her appearance a silent sermon on loss, piety, and the strict social order of her time.
Widows and religion, convents and charity. For the peasant widow, the parish church was the center of her spiritual life, but for a small number of widows, particularly those who were older, had no dependent children, or possessed some modest means, the church could offer more than just weekly solace. It could provide an entirely new path in life, a way to structure her existence around faith in a more formal and all-encompassing way. This could involve retreating from the secular world into a religious community, or, conversely, becoming a pillar of religious charity within her own village. The most definitive religious path a widow could take was to enter a convent and become a nun. This was an option generally reserved for women of higher social standing, as convents often required a significant dowry for a new novice to be admitted. However, it was not entirely unheard of for a woman of more humble origins, especially a widow with the reputation for great piety, to be accepted into a less wealthy or prestigious religious house. For a woman who had lost her husband and seen her children grown, the convent offered a life of security, community, and spiritual purpose. Life in a convent was highly structured. organized around the Opus Dei, the divine office of daily prayers. The constant rhythm of prayer, study, and manual labor provided a new framework for a life that had been thrown into chaos. The convent was a community of women, a ready-made sisterhood that could replace the family and social networks she had lost. It offered protection from the pressures and dangers of the secular world, including the pressure to remarry. In the cloister, a widow could dedicate the remainder of her life entirely to God, a choice that was seen as the highest and most noble path she could take. A more accessible option for many women, particularly in the towns and cities of the Low Countries in Germany, was to join a community of beguines. Beguines were laywomen who chose to live a religious life in the world without taking permanent formal vows. They lived together in communities called beguinishes, which could range from a single house to an entire walled town within a town. They supported themselves through their own labor, often in the textile trades, and devoted themselves to prayer, contemplation, and charitable works. For a widow, the beguinish offered a perfect blend of independence and community. She could live a pious life without the irrevocable commitment of monastic vows, and she remained in control of her own property. It was a life of respected, self-sufficient spinsterhood centered on faith. However, for the vast majority of peasant widows, entering a religious institution was not a realistic option. Instead, they expressed their devotion by becoming models of piety and charity within their own villages. An older widow, freed from the most demanding aspects of child-rearing and agricultural labor, might dedicate her time to the care of the parish church. She might be responsible for washing the altar linens, providing flowers for the altar, or keeping the church clean. She would be a constant presence at daily Mass, her prayers a steady, quiet hum in the background of village life. Such a woman could also become a conduit for charity in her community. She might be the one who organized the distribution of alms to the other poor, who visited the sick to offer comfort and simple remedies, and who sat with the dying. By embodying the Christian ideal of caritas, she could transform her own experience of suffering into a source of compassion for others. This work gave her a new and powerful role in the village. She was no longer just a poor widow, she was a holy woman, a figure of immense moral authority and respect. This path was not an easy one. It required a deep and abiding faith and a willingness to live a life of self-denial. But it offered a way for a widow to find profound meaning and a new sense of purpose in the wake of her loss. It allowed her to redefine herself, not by the husband she had lost, but by the faith she had found. Whether by retreating into the formal structure of a convent or by becoming a beacon of piety in her own village, these women demonstrated that widowhood could be more than an ending. It could be a new beginning, a doorway into a life of deep spiritual significance.
The emotional toll. Beneath the practical struggles and the public performances of the peasant widow lay a vast and silent interior world of emotion. In an age that had little vocabulary for psychology, her feelings were often unexpressed and unacknowledged, yet they were the constant, invisible current that shaped her days and haunted her nights. The emotional toll of widowhood was a heavy burden, a complex tapestry woven from threads of grief, fear, loneliness, and a quiet, resilient strength. The most immediate and overwhelming emotion was, of course, grief. This was not a simple linear process, but a chaotic and unpredictable sea. There were waves of profound, aching sorrow that could strike at any moment, triggered by the sight of her husband's empty chair, the feel of his woolen cloak, or a memory surfacing unbidden. This sorrow was a physical weight, a weariness in her bones that made the heavy labor of her days feel even more impossible. There were also flashes of anger at God for taking him, at the illness that had stolen him away, or even at her husband himself for leaving her to face this impossible life alone. And beneath it all, there was often a layer of guilt, a litany of what-ifs and if-onlys, a self-blame for things unsaid or undone. Closely intertwined with grief was fear. This was a constant low-level hum of anxiety that never fully disappeared. She feared the future, an unknown and intimidating landscape that she now had to navigate by herself. She feared for her children, for their health, their safety, and their prospects. She feared the harvest failing, the Lord raising the rent, or the pig falling sick. She feared the long, dark nights, the strange noises outside her cottage, and the vulnerability of being a woman alone. This fear could be paralyzing, a cold hand that clutched at her heart in the dead of night, making sleep a fleeting and precious commodity. Loneliness was a different kind of pain, a dull, persistent ache. It was the absence of companionship, the lack of a partner with whom to share the small victories and the daily frustrations of life. There was no one to talk to at the end of a long day, no one to share a knowing glance with, no one whose physical presence provided a simple, unspoken comfort. The village was full of people, but she was surrounded by couples, a constant, painful reminder of what she had lost. The silence in her cottage was not peaceful. It was a testament to her isolation, a sound that amplified her solitude. Yet the emotional landscape of the widow was not solely of despair. Within this difficult terrain, there were also shoots of resilience and strength. To survive, she had to cultivate a deep well of inner fortitude. She had to learn to be self-reliant, to trust her own judgment, and to find a strength she may not have known she possessed. Each day that she successfully fed her children, tended her crops, and kept her household together was a small victory, a quiet affirmation of her own capacity to endure. These small triumphs could be a source of a fierce, quiet pride. In some cases, particularly if the marriage had been difficult or abusive, widowhood might also bring a complex and often unacknowledged sense of relief. The freedom from a harsh or demanding husband could feel like a burden being lifted. This was a dangerous and socially unacceptable feeling, one that a widow would have to keep buried deep within her, but it could be part of her emotional reality nonetheless. This feeling of release could coexist with genuine grief, creating a confusing and contradictory inner state. The emotional world of the peasant widow was a place of profound complexity. It was a landscape of deep shadows, but also of surprising light. She was not just a one-dimensional figure of sorrow. She was a woman experiencing the full, messy spectrum of human emotion, all while carrying on with the relentless demands of her life. Her emotional toll was the unseen work of her widowhood, a silent, daily struggle to process her past, endure her present, and find the courage to face her future. Remarriage laws and customs. The question of remarriage for a peasant widow was governed by a dense thicket of laws, customs, and economic realities. The decision was rarely hers alone. It was a matter of public interest involving the lord of the manor, the families involved, and the community at large. The path to a second marriage was a legal and social obstacle course, with each step regulated by traditions designed to protect property, maintain social order, and ensure the continued productivity of the land. The central figure in the legal drama of remarriage was the lord of the manor. Because the widow held her land as his tenant, he claimed a direct interest in who would become its new male master. The lord's primary concern was not the widow's happiness, but the stability and profitability of his estate. He wanted the land to be in the hands of a capable, able-bodied man who could perform the required labor services and pay the rents and fees on time. To this end, the lord often held the right to approve or even arrange a widow's second marriage. A widow could not simply marry whomever she pleased. Any potential suitor would have to be acceptable to the lord. In some cases, if a widow delayed in finding a new husband, the lord might present her with a candidate of his own choosing. To refuse such a match could be perilous, as the lord might use her refusal as a pretext to declare her an uncooperative tenant and confiscate her land. For the privilege of marrying one of his tenants, the new husband, or sometimes the widow herself, was required to pay a fee to the lord. This payment was known as a merchet or foremarriage. The amount varied, but it could be a significant sum, equivalent to a year's wages or the price of a cow. This payment was a clear statement of the lord's authority. He was, in essence, the owner of his tenant's marriageability, and he expected to be paid for its transfer.
The widow's own legal rights were a key factor in the marriage negotiation. Her dower, or free bench rights, her legal claim to a portion of her first husband's land, were her most valuable asset. A widow with a substantial dower holding was a very attractive marriage prospect. A suitor was not just marrying her, he was marrying her land. This gave the widow a degree of leverage. She could choose between potential suitors, selecting the man who seemed most likely to be a good husband and a capable manager of the property. However, the moment she remarried, her legal relationship to that property changed. Her dower rights were usually extinguished upon remarriage. The land would now be held by her new husband, in his name. While he would manage it for the benefit of the new family unit, she lost her direct personal claim to it. She was once again a femme couvert, her legal identity absorbed by her husband. This was the great gamble of remarriage. She traded her independent control over property for the potential security of a new partnership. The customs surrounding inheritance also played a crucial role. A widow with sons from her first marriage had to consider their future. The land she held was their rightful inheritance. A new stepfather might be a poor steward of that inheritance. Manorial custom often included provisions to protect the rights of these children. A new husband might have to formally swear in the manorial court that he would protect the children's inheritance and treat them fairly. But these promises were not always kept, and the potential for conflict between a stepfather and his stepsons was a constant source of anxiety. The community also had its say. A widow's choice of a new husband was a subject of intense local interest and gossip. Marrying a man from outside the village could be met with suspicion. Marrying a man who was significantly younger or poorer could lead to ridicule. The community expected a match that was suitable, one that maintained the social and economic equilibrium of the village. The entire process of remarriage was a public negotiation, played out in the manorial court and in the court of public opinion. It was a transaction involving property, labor, and lineage. For the widow at the center of it all, it was a path fraught with risk and opportunity, a decision that required a careful calculation of her own needs, her children's future, and the unyielding demands of the law.
Widows and family dynamics. The death of a husband sent ripples of change throughout a widow's entire family network. Her relationships with her own kin, her late husband's family, and her children were all fundamentally altered. This web of family ties could be her strongest safety net, a source of crucial emotional and practical support. But it could also become a source of intense conflict and pressure as the family realigned itself around the new reality of her widowhood. The dynamics of the family were a powerful force, capable of either buoying her up or pulling her under. Her relationship with her own blood relatives, her parents and siblings, often became more important than ever. If they lived in the same village, they were her most natural allies. Her father or brother could provide the male presence she needed to negotiate with the Lord's reeve or to stand for her in the manorial court. Her mother or sister could offer practical help with childcare and domestic tasks, as well as the unique comfort of shared history and unconditional love. This support, however, was not limitless. Her kin had their own families to prioritize, and their ability to help was constrained by their own poverty. Still, the bond of blood was a powerful one, and a widow with a strong network of her own relatives was in a much better position than one who had married into a village far from her childhood home. The relationship with her late husband's family, her in-laws, was often far more complicated and fraught with tension. While a sense of duty and affection might lead them to offer support, their interests were often directly opposed to hers, particularly when it came to property. The land that the widow held as her dower was, in their eyes, part of their family's patrimony. They might view her as an obstacle, preventing their own son, her brother-in-law, from taking over the land. This could lead to bitter disputes. Her in-laws might try to undermine her position with the lord of the manor,
spreading rumors about her or questioning her ability to manage the land. They might dispute the boundaries of her dower property or challenge her rights to certain resources. If she had no children, the pressure from her late husband's family to relinquish the land and remarry could be immense. She was a stranger in their family line, and her presence on their ancestral land could be deeply resented. Her own children were at the very center of these shifting dynamics. As a widow, her identity was now almost entirely defined by her role as a mother. Her bond with her children could deepen, forged in the shared experience of loss. However, the new family structure also created new strains. If she had a grown son, he would become the de facto man of the house. This could be a huge source of support, but it also inverted the traditional family hierarchy. She was now dependent on the son she had raised. This could lead to a delicate power struggle, as he sought to assert his new authority, and she struggled to maintain her role as the head of the household. If she considered remarrying, her children's feelings and future were a primary concern. Her children might resent a new man taking their father's place at the hearth and in their mother's affections. More tangibly, they would fear for their inheritance. A new stepmother might favor his own biological children or simply be a poor manager of the family's assets. The widow had to act as a fierce protector of her first husband's lineage, ensuring that her children's rights were not compromised by her own search for security. As the years passed, the widow's role in the family would continue to evolve. She would become a mother-in-law. Her relationship with her son's or daughter's spouse introduced a new layer of complexity. She would become a grandmother, a respected elder, and a repository of family history and tradition. Her cottage might become the emotional center of a sprawling, multi-generational family. The family was the crucible in which the widow's fate was forged. It was a microcosm of the wider world, a place of love and obligation, but also of conflict, jealousy, and competing interests. Her ability to skillfully manage these complex dynamics, to nurture her allies and neutralize her rivals, was one of the most important and least visible aspects of her long struggle for survival.
Widows' legal documents and wills. In a world where the vast majority of peasants were illiterate, the concept of a legal document might seem out of place. Yet, even in this oral culture, certain forms of documentation and legal record-keeping were crucial, and for a widow, they could be the difference between security and destitution. While she might not be able to read or write herself, she understood the power of the written word and the formal legal processes that governed her life. Her interaction with these documents, however indirect, was a vital part of her strategy for survival and for securing a legacy for her children. The most important legal document in the peasant's life was the manorial court roll. This was the official record of the proceedings of the manorial court, meticulously kept by a literate clerk, usually in Latin. When a widow appeared in court to claim her dower rights, her decision was inscribed in this roll. Her name, the name of her late husband, a description of the land she was granted, and the conditions of her tenancy, all were recorded. This written entry was her proof of title. It was the official, legally binding evidence of her right to her home and her land. If her right was ever challenged by a greedy neighbor, a resentful in-law, or even the Lord himself, she could appeal to the court roll. She would ask the court to consult the record, to have the clerk read aloud the entry that confirmed her rights. The memory of the community was fallible, but the written word in the court roll carried an immense authority. For the illiterate widow, the court roll was a mysterious but powerful talisman, a document she could not read, but upon which her entire future depended. She would have to trust the clerk to have recorded it accurately, and the court to respect its authority. Beyond the court roll, a widow had to be acutely aware of the various financial records that could impact her life. Her husband may have had outstanding debts, and a creditor might produce a charter of debt, or a tally stick, a notched piece of wood that served as a primitive receipt, as proof. The widow would have to defend herself against these claims, often with nothing more than her own word and her reputation for honesty. Conversely, if her husband was owed money, she would have to try to collect it, a difficult task without written proof. One of the most significant legal acts a widow could perform was the making of a will. While the land she held was not hers to bequeath, as it would pass according to manorial custom, her personal, movable goods were. In the later Middle Ages, it became increasingly common for people of all social classes, including peasants, to make a will to dispose of their personal property. For a widow, this was a final and profound act of agency. She would summon the parish priest who would act as a scribe, and perhaps a few trusted neighbors to serve as witnesses. Then she would dictate her wishes. The will would typically begin with a declaration of faith, commending her soul to God. Then she would list her possessions and who should receive them. To her daughter, she might leave her best cooking pot and her bedding. To her son, she might leave a precious iron tool. She might leave her second-best dress to a sister or a close friend. A small bequest might be made to the parish church, perhaps a few pence or a pound of wax for candles, to ensure prayers would be said for her soul. The act of making a will was empowering. It allowed her to distribute the fruits of her long life of labor according to her own wishes. It was a way to reward those who had been kind to her and to ensure that her most cherished possessions went to those she loved. The written will, authenticated by the priest and the witnesses, gave her a voice that would speak after her death, a final assertion of her will and her identity. While most peasant widows lived and died without ever touching a pen, they were not ignorant of the power of legal documents. They understood that their rights were enshrined in the court rolls and that their final wishes could be preserved in a will. Their engagement with this world of text and law, often through literate male intermediaries like priests and clerks, was a crucial, if often overlooked, part of their struggle to secure their place in the world and to shape the future for the generations that would follow.
Widow's legacy in history and folklore. The figure of the widow looms large in the cultural imagination of the Middle Ages. She appears again and again in sermons, in literature, in legal texts, and in the rich, earthy world of folklore. This cultural legacy is complex and often contradictory. The widow was a screen onto which medieval society projected its deepest anxieties about women, property, and social order, as well as its highest ideals of piety and endurance. The way she was portrayed in these stories and texts both reflected and shaped the real-life experiences of peasant widows. In the official culture of the church, the widow was often presented as an idealized figure of Christian virtue. Sermons and saints' lives praised the pious widow, the woman who, after her husband's death, dedicated herself to a life of chastity, prayer, and good works. She was held up as a model of female devotion, second only to the Virgin. This idealization gave the state of widowhood a certain dignity and respectability. It created a socially acceptable and even honored role for a woman alone. For a real peasant widow, this ideal could be a source of comfort and a path to earning community respect. However, this same official culture could also view the widow with suspicion. The Church Fathers wrote at length about the perceived weaknesses of women, their susceptibility to temptation, and their supposedly insatiable desires. From this perspective, the widow was a dangerous figure, a woman without a man to control her. This led to the creation of another powerful stereotype, the lusty widow. This character was portrayed as being eager to remarry, driven by her carnal appetites, and often using her newfound freedom and control over property to manipulate men. We see this stereotype most famously in high literature, such as Geoffrey Chaucer's Wife of Bath. Though she is a bourgeois woman, not a peasant, her character embodies many of the traits that society feared in a widow. She is experienced, outspoken, financially independent, and unapologetic about her enjoyment of life and her control over her 5 husbands. While celebrated by modern readers as a proto-feminist figure, in her own time she would have been seen as a transgressive and comical, yet slightly threatening character. In the world of folklore and popular ballads, the widow took on other forms. Sometimes she was the merry widow, a figure of fun who outsmarts a greedy suitor or a corrupt official. These tales often celebrated her shrewdness and resilience, offering a more positive spin on her independence. But folklore also contained a much darker image, the old widow as a witch or a malevolent crone. In fairy tales and folk stories, the isolated old woman living in a cottage in the woods is often a figure of sinister power. She is the wicked stepmother, the child-eating hag, the woman who lays curses. As we have seen, this reflected a real-world fear. The elderly, solitary widow, with her knowledge of herbs and her marginal social position, was a natural candidate for the role of the village scapegoat. These stories both reflected and reinforced the superstitions that could make an old widow's life so dangerous. The peasant widow herself would have been aware of these competing narratives. She would have heard the priest's praise for the pious widow from the pulpit. She would have listened to the minstrel's song about the merry widow in the tavern, and she would have known the chilling tales of the old crone told around the fire. Her own life was a navigation of these cultural waters. She had to strive to live up to the ideal of the pious widow to gain respect, while simultaneously fearing that she might be cast in the role of the lusty widow or the wicked crone if she stepped out of line. This rich and varied cultural legacy shows us that the widow was a figure of immense symbolic importance. She was a living embodiment of some of society's most pressing questions. What is the proper role of a woman? Who should control property? How should the vulnerable be treated? The stories told about her are a window into the values and fears of the medieval world, and a testament to the enduring power of the solitary female figure to fascinate, inspire, and frighten.
Life beyond loss. The story of the medieval peasant widow is, by its very nature, a story steeped in hardship. We have walked with her through the shadows of grief, the relentless toil of her days, and the cold anxieties of her nights. It is a narrative of struggle, of vulnerability, and of loss. And yet, to end her story there would be to miss the most profound truth of her existence. For the vast majority of these women, widowhood was not the end of their story. It was a long and difficult chapter, but it was one they survived. The ultimate legacy of the peasant widow is one of quiet, uncelebrated, and astonishing resilience. Life beyond the initial, shattering loss was a slow and painstaking process of adaptation. It was learning to live with the silence, to find a new rhythm for her days. It was discovering a strength within herself that she may never have known she possessed. The woman who had once deferred to her husband's decisions now had to learn to be decisive. The woman who relied on his strength now had to find her own. This transformation, forced upon her by tragedy, was a quiet and personal evolution. Her life became a testament to her ingenuity. She learned to mend a fence, to bargain shrewdly at the market, to read the weather for the best time to plant her small garden. She became a master of making do, of stretching a small amount of food to feed her family for another day, of patching a worn-out garment one more time. Her survival was a daily masterpiece of small, practical victories. And in this new life, there could be unexpected moments of grace and even joy. There was the deep, fierce pride of watching her children grow, knowing that it was her labor and her love that had sustained them. There was the satisfaction of a successful harvest, the culmination of her own hard work. There was the simple pleasure of a warm fire on a cold night, the taste of bread she had baked with her own hands, or the sound of her children's laughter. These moments of light were made all the more precious by the darkness that surrounded them. She also found a new kind of community. Her bond with other women in the village, particularly other widows, could become a source of profound solidarity. They understood her struggles in a way no one else could. They shared her burdens, her fears, and her small triumphs. In their company, she was not just a pitiable figure, but a peer, a survivor among survivors. As she grew older, her role would shift again. If she had successfully raised her children and held on to her land, she could become a respected matriarch. Her cottage, once a place of sorrow, could become the warm, stable center of a growing family. She was the keeper of memories, the repository of family history, the elder whose wisdom was sought by her children and grandchildren. Having navigated the treacherous waters of widowhood, she had earned a unique and powerful status, one built not on the protection of a man, but on her own proven strength and endurance. The story of the peasant widow is not, in the end, a story about what was lost. It is a story about what remained. It is about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. It is about the quiet courage required to get up each morning and face a world that was not designed for you. The millions of peasant women who lived and died as widows left few records. Their names are largely forgotten, their individual stories lost to time, but their collective legacy is written across the landscape of history. It is the legacy of survival, of adaptation, and of the quiet, enduring strength that allowed life to go on, even in the wake of the most profound silence. As we settle into our own quiet, let us remember their silent, steadfast strength and find in it a deep and restful peace.